Okay, I'm gonna be attempting to say Mr. Beast 1,000 times. I don't know how long this will take. Maybe like. Okay. Wait, hold on. Stop. Reset. Okay, Mr. Beast. 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 Beast. Mr. 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 Beast. 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 Mr. 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 Beast.
You just
Mr.
said
Beast.
Mrs. Beast.
Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Beast. Mr. 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 Beast. Beast. Mr. 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 Beast. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. That's 300. I'm gonna go grab a drink and I'll see you in a second. Okay, I'm back and I just got me a huge glass of cream soda because this is gonna take a while. I did the math and it'll be around 16 to 17 minutes before this is. I've just sent Mr. Beast, so keyboard and let's go. Mr. Beast, 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 400 times. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. 500, so it should be like 17 minutes. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. B, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. B, Mr. Beast, Mr. B, Mr. Beast, Beast, Mr. 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 B, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. It's still recording now. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. B, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. B, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, oh, Mr. Beast, oh, what did I do? Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. 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 Beast, 800. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 900. 100 left. Mr. Beast, 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 and Mr. Beast. That is 1,017 minutes and 46 seconds. Holy crap. Okay, that felt way longer than freaking 17 minutes and 46 seconds. Hold on. 1,000. Okay, that's the end of the video, obviously. Subscribe if you're a fan of Mr. Beast, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video.